In November of 1916, the largest moving object ever built by human hands slipped out of Naples harbor painted white as bone. His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic. 48,000 tons, 900 feet long. Sister to Titanic, but this time they'd learned. More lifeboats, higher bulkheads, reinforced plating, £7.5 million spent to build a ship that could survive anything the sea could offer. They called her unsinkable, and this time they meant it. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. Not on a ship built to learn from tragedy. Not in calm seas. Not in broad daylight. And yet within an hour, she was gone. Sunk faster than Titanic, with better crew, better design, and every lesson of 1912 burned into her blueprints. This is the dark story of Titanic's now unsinkable sister, Britannic. We're going to cover everything. The staggering luxury she was built to provide, the war that stole her maiden voyage, the people aboard that November morning, and the 55 minutes that turned the world's safest ship into a sealed question on the seabed. Was it an enemy weapon? A hidden fire? Or something they brought aboard in Naples? The survivors all live to tell different versions, and no two stories quite align. The Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable. They'd said that about her sister, of course. But this time, they meant it. This time, they'd learned. Britannic left Naples that morning bound for the island of Lemnos, near the Turkish coast, to collect wounded men from what remained of the Gallipoli campaign. She carried over 1,000 souls. Most were crew. Some were nurses. A handful were doctors. There were no passengers in the usual sense. No tycoons in evening dress. No debutantes practicing their French in the palm court. Just orderlies, stretcher bearers, and a few dozen members of the voluntary aid detachment, young women from good families who had volunteered to bandage men whose legs had been sawn off in field tents. The ship's grand staircase still stood, oak and wrought iron rising through 6 decks. But the landings were lined now with iron cots and rolled gauze instead of potted ferns. The weather was perfect. The Aegean that morning was calm, almost glassy, the kind of blue that doesn't exist anywhere else. Britannic steamed northeast at 21 knots, her triple-screw propellers cutting white trails through water so clear you could see the rocks 30 feet down. On deck, off-duty nurses leaned against the rail and smoked cigarettes in the sun. Below, in what had once been the first-class dining saloon, 220 beds waited in rows, their sheets pulled tight as drumheads. The room still had its leaded glass windows, though they'd been boarded over on the inside to protect them. Pale green tile covered the walls. A chandelier the size of a carriage hung from the ceiling, wrapped in canvas and tied with rope so it wouldn't swing. It was a strange thing, that ship. Built for pleasure, dressed for war. She'd been launched in 1914 at Harland and Wolff's Yard in Belfast, the youngest of 3 sisters. Olympic, Titanic, Britannic. The Olympic-class liners, they called them. The largest moving objects ever constructed by human hands. Each one nearly 900 feet long. Each one 11 decks high. Combined, the 3 ships had cost £7.5 million to design and build, an almost incomprehensible sum. That's roughly £1 billion in today's money. White Star Line had staked everything on them, and by November 1916, 2 of the 3 were already gone. Titanic, of course, had gone down in 1912, 4 days into her maiden voyage. 1,500 dead. The name became synonymous with hubris, with the dangers of calling anything unsinkable. But Britannic was supposed to be different. The designers had gone back, after Titanic, and made changes. More lifeboats. Enough for everyone aboard, twice over. The watertight bulkheads had been raised higher, extending all the way up to B deck in some sections instead of stopping at E. The inner skin of the hull had been reinforced with a double layer of plating along the engine rooms and coal bunkers. A system of giant gantry davits had been installed that could swing lifeboats out over the side even if the ship was listing badly. They'd thought of everything. Or so they believed. She'd never carried a paying passenger. War broke out in August 1914, just months before Britannic was supposed to enter service. White Star Line handed her over to the Admiralty. She was fitted out as a hospital ship, her palatial staterooms stripped or converted, her public rooms filled with medical equipment. By 1916, she'd made 5 voyages to the eastern Mediterranean, ferrying thousands of wounded men back to Britain. She was good at it. Fast, stable, comfortable even in rough seas. The wounded called her the Great White Whale. Some of the nurses said she was the most beautiful ship they'd ever seen, even dressed in her wartime plainness. But beauty, of course, is no armor. The ship's company that morning included Captain Charles Bartlett, a White Star veteran in his 50s, a man known for an almost unsettling calmness under pressure. They called him Iceberg Charlie, though never to his face. He'd served on Olympic, Britannic's eldest sister, and had a reputation for caution bordering on paranoia. He trusted nothing. Not the charts, not the lookouts, not even the engineers. He walked the decks at odd hours, checking hatch seals himself, testing the dogs on watertight doors with his own hands. If you were going to be aboard a ship in a war zone, you wanted a man like Bartlett on the bridge. Among the nurses was Violet Jessup, 29 years old, dark-haired, soft-spoken, already a legend in the small world of White Star stewardesses. She had survived the sinking of Titanic 4 years earlier, plucked from the North Atlantic in a lifeboat after watching the great ship slide under. She'd gone back to work for White Star almost immediately. Some people thought that was mad. She thought it was practical. The sea was her living. What else was she supposed to do? When war came, she'd volunteered as a nurse with the Voluntary Aid Detachment and been assigned to Britannic. It felt, she wrote later, like coming home. The same smell of salt and brass polish, the same creak of the deck underfoot, the same low hum of the engines, a sound you felt more than heard, a vibration that came up through the soles of your shoes and settled in your chest. She didn't talk much about Titanic. Neither did the other White Star crew. There were a handful aboard Britannic who had been there that night. A steward, a fireman, a junior officer. They recognized each other by a certain look, a way of glancing at the lifeboats when they walked past. But they didn't speak of it. What was there to say? The ship herself was a study in contrasts. Built for the North Atlantic luxury trade, she still carried traces of that old world even under her hospital fittings. The grand staircase, for instance. It was still there, rising from D-deck all the way up to the boat deck, a sweeping curve of carved oak and iron balustrades. At the top, where the dome should have let in natural light through leaded glass, there was now just canvas and wooden bracing, painted white. But the clock was still there, mounted in the central panel, flanked by 2 carved figures representing honor and glory. The clock still ran. Someone wound it every morning. The first-class smoking room, aft on A-deck, had been converted into an officer's ward. It still had its mahogany paneling, though the leather chairs had been removed. In their place stood 30 iron frame beds, each one fitted with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. The stained glass windows remained, depicting scenes of exploration and conquest. Sunlight came through in reds and golds and pooled on the tile floor. Wounded officers lay in those beds and stared up at coffered ceilings covered in gilded plasterwork. It must have felt like dying in a cathedral. Deeper in the ship, things were more utilitarian. The third-class areas had always been plain, and now they were plainer still. Bare metal walls, linoleum floors, rows of pipe-frame bunks for the stretcher-bearers and orderlies. But even here, there were small touches of the ship's original purpose. Brass fixtures polished to a shine, teak handrails, oval windows with brass dogs that sealed them watertight, Britannic had been built to impress, and even war couldn't completely erase that. The swimming pool was still there, down on F-deck. It had been the largest on any ship, fed by heated seawater, lined with blue and white tiles imported from Portugal. The tiles alone had cost £3,000. Now the pool was drained, the bottom covered with planks, and the space used for physiotherapy. Wounded men with shattered hips and missing feet learned to walk again between the same pillars where first-class passengers were supposed to have lounged in deck chairs, sipping gin. There was a pipe organ built into the aft wall of the first-class dining saloon, an enormous instrument with gilded pipes that rose 2 decks high. It had never been played. The ship had gone to war before anyone ever sat at the keys. The pipes were wrapped in oiled canvas now, protected against salt air, waiting for a concert that would never come. Britannic's engines were the same type as Titanic's. 2 4-cylinder triple expansion reciprocating engines, each one 4 stories tall, each one driving an outboard propeller. Between them, a low-pressure turbine took exhaust steam and drove the center screw. Together, they produced 50,000 horsepower. The ship could make 23 knots in calm seas, faster than almost anything afloat except for destroyers and light cruisers. Speed was safety. Speed meant you could outrun submarines. At least that was the theory. The coal bunkers held 6,000 tons. She burned 850 tons a day at full speed. That meant a range of roughly 2,000 miles before she needed to refuel, enough to reach Lemnos and back with a comfortable margin. The bunkers were steel cells built into the sides of the ship, a double wall between the sea and the engine rooms. More armor, more protection. After Titanic, the designers had obsessed over the coal bunkers, reinforcing them, sealing them, adding pumps and drainage systems. Coal was dirty, dangerous, prone to spontaneous combustion if it got too warm, but it was also a kind of cushion. A mine or torpedo that hit a coal bunker might be absorbed, its force dampened by thousands of tons of dust and rock. Or so the thinking went. By the morning of November 21st, Britannic had been at sea for 3 days. She'd stopped briefly at Messina to take on coal and fresh water, then continued east. The plan was to reach Lemnos by evening, anchor overnight, and begin loading wounded men the next morning. Gallipoli had been a disaster. Everyone knew that. Thousands of British, Australian, and New Zealand troops had been cut to pieces trying to take the Turkish peninsula. The survivors had been evacuated months earlier, but men were still dying from infections, from shrapnel wounds that wouldn't heal, from gas gangrene that turned their limbs black. Britannic would take on as many as she could carry, perhaps 1,500, and bring them back to hospitals in Naples or Southampton. It was grim work, but necessary. The ship was good at it. The Key Channel lies between the Greek mainland and the island of Kea, a narrow passage of deep water flanked by rocks and cliffs. It's a shortcut, a way to avoid the longer route around the southern cape. Britannic entered the channel just after 8 in the morning. The sun was already warm. The sea was empty. No other ships in sight. Just blue water, white cliffs, and the distant hum of the engines. Captain Bartlett stood on the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the coastline slide past. He'd made this run a dozen times. He knew the channel, knew the rocks, knew the currents. But he also knew the Germans had been laying mines. Hundreds of them, dropped at night by small boats or submarines, drifting on anchored cables just below the surface. The Aegean was thick with them. Hospital ships were supposed to be immune, protected under international law by their white paint and red crosses, but Bartlett didn't trust the Germans to honor that. He'd ordered extra lookouts posted. He'd reduced speed slightly, to give the ship more time to maneuver if they spotted anything. But there were limits to what caution could achieve. You couldn't see a mine until you were almost on top of it. And by then, it was usually too late. At 8:12 in the morning, Britannic's bow struck something beneath the surface. The explosion came from the starboard side, just forward of the bridge, somewhere near the junction of watertight compartments 5 and 6. A column of white water shot up, higher than the funnels, and came down across the foredeck in a roar of spray and steam. The blast was enormous, a single violent shudder that rattled every rivet in the hull and threw men off their feet 3 decks below. In the forward hospital ward, nurses and patients were hurled against bulkheads. Glass shattered. Beds slid. A surgical tray went skittering across the floor, scalpels and forceps scattering like dice. Violet Jessup was in the pantry outside the officers' mess, stacking clean linens. She felt the shock before she heard it, a sharp upward jolt as if the ship had run aground, and then a deep metallic boom that echoed through the walls. The lights flickered. Somewhere below, an alarm bell began to ring. On the bridge, Captain Bartlett didn't move. He gripped the rail and stared forward, watching the water drain off the foredeck, watching the hole appear. It was big. 20 feet across, maybe more, a ragged tear in the plating just above the waterline, though the ship's forward motion was already driving water into it, forcing the bow down. He could see into the ship, into the darkness of the hold, and he could hear the roar of water pouring in, a sound like a waterfall in an enclosed space. He knew immediately what it was. A mine. German. Probably one of the new horned contact types, 1,000 pounds of high explosive in a steel shell, floating 10 feet below the surface. Britannic had run straight into it at 21 knots. The impact had driven the mine against the hull and triggered the detonator, and now the sea was pouring into his ship through a wound that no watertight door could seal. He gave orders quickly, calmly, his voice flat and unhurried. Close all watertight doors. Stop engines. Send a distress signal. Prepare the lifeboats. He did not, at that moment, order an evacuation. There was no need. Britannic had been built to survive this. She could float with 6 compartments flooded. 6. Titanic had only managed 4. This was supposed to be different. But within 3 minutes, it became clear that something was very wrong. The watertight doors in the forward sections didn't close. They'd been damaged by the blast, their frames warped, their hydraulic lines severed. Water was pouring not just into compartment 5, but into 6, and then 7, flowing through cable ducts and ventilation shafts, bypassing the bulkheads entirely. Worse, many of the portholes were open. It was standard practice on a hospital ship to ventilate the wards, to let fresh air circulate, and reduce the smell of disinfectant and gangrene. But now those open portholes were scooping seawater as the bow dipped, funneling thousands of gallons into spaces that should have stayed dry. Bartlett watched the trim indicator tilt. 2 degrees down by the bow. Then 3. Then 5. The ship was flooding faster than the pumps could manage, faster than the designers had ever anticipated. He made a decision. If he couldn't save the ship by sealing her, he'd save her by beaching her. The island of Kea was less than 3 miles away, visible off the starboard bow. If he could drive Britannic onto the rocks, run her aground in shallow water, she might settle on the bottom with her superstructure still above the surface. The wounded could be taken off by small boats. The ship could be salvaged later. It was a gamble, but it was the only option left. He ordered the engines restarted. Full ahead. Turned toward the island. Far below, in the engine rooms, the crew obeyed. The great reciprocating engines began to turn again. Slowly at first, then faster. The massive cranks rising and falling. The connecting rods longer than a man is tall, pushing the ship forward even as her bow sank deeper. Britannic surged ahead, picking up speed, 6 knots, then 8. Her stern lifting slightly as her nose went down. It must have been a strange sight from the shore. A giant white hospital ship, wounded and listing, driving herself towards the rocks at flank speed, her propellers churning the sea to foam. But Bartlett had miscalculated. Or perhaps there was simply no correct calculation to make. Because as the ship moved forward, the water pouring through the bow wound increased. The faster she went, the more pressure forced water into the hull. and the open portholes, now fully submerged on the starboard side, became intakes, feeding the flood. Britannic's bow sank lower, 10 degrees, 15. The forward well deck went under. Water began to pour over the bulkhead into compartment 3. At 8:20, just 8 minutes after the explosion, Captain Bartlett accepted the inevitable. He ordered the engine stopped and gave the command to abandon ship. The order to abandon ship passed through Britannic like a shudder. Not panic, not yet, but a kind of collective held breath. The crew had drilled for this. They knew their stations. The nurses knew theirs. The lifeboat davits were already swung out, the falls cleared, the boats uncovered and ready. Britannic carried 64 lifeboats, enough for 3,000 people. More than enough. The designers had learned that lesson at least. But there are things you cannot drill for. The cant of a deck tilting under your feet, steeper with every passing second. The groan of steel under strain, a low moaning that comes from deep in the hull, as if the ship itself is in pain. The knowledge that you are standing on 48,000 tons of steel that is sinking beneath you, and the nearest land is just close enough to see, but too far to swim. Violet Jessup made her way to her lifeboat station, on the starboard side, B-deck, helping to carry a stretcher as she went. The man on it had lost both legs above the knee, blown off by a Turkish shell 3 months earlier. He was conscious, pale, gripping the edges of the canvas. He didn't speak. The nurses moved quickly but without rushing, their training holding against the fear. They'd been taught to project calm. The patients were watching. If the nurses panicked, everyone would panic. The ship's list to starboard was already pronounced, perhaps 10 degrees, enough that walking felt wrong, as if the floor had been built crooked. Violet could feel the deck shifting under her shoes, a slow, continuous tilt, and she knew it would get worse. She'd felt this before, 4 years ago, in water so cold it burned. She remembered the way Titanic's deck had angled in those final minutes. How hard it had been to keep your footing. How people had slid and stumbled and clutched at railings that were no longer level. She did not want to remember. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. On the boat deck, crewmen worked the davits, swinging the lifeboats out over the side. The boats were wooden, clinker-built, each one 30 feet long, and capable of carrying 65 people if you packed them tight. They hung from steel cables, suspended over a drop that was already nearly 70 feet to the water. Normally, you'd lower them gently, hand over hand, controlling the descent with brake wheels. But there was no time for gently. The ship was going down fast, far faster than anyone had expected, and the officers were shouting at the crew to load and lower, load and lower. Get them into the water before the deck went under. Some of the lifeboats launched smoothly. Number 12 on the port side went down fully loaded, 50 people including a doctor and 8 nurses, and hit the water without incident. The crew rowed clear, pulling hard to get away from the ship's side before the suction took them. Number 14 followed, then 16. On the starboard side, the list made everything harder. The boats had to be hauled inward before they could be lowered, man-handled over the tilting deck, and even then they scraped against the hull on the way down, grinding paint and leaving streaks of white wood. But some of the crew, perhaps understandably, did not wait for orders. 2 lifeboats on the starboard side, numbers 28 and 30, were lowered prematurely by crewmen who thought they saw the deck about to go under. They may have been firemen, stokers, men from deep in the ship who had climbed up through flooding passageways and wanted nothing more than to be off this vessel and into open air. They released the falls, and the boats dropped, hitting the water hard, 60 feet below, and immediately began to drift aft along the hull. This should not have been a problem. The engines had been stopped. Captain Bartlett had ordered full stop 8 minutes earlier. But an engine the size of Britannic's does not stop instantly. It winds down slowly, the momentum bleeding off through friction and back pressure, and the propellers continue to turn, coasting, driven by the ship's own weight and the flow of water past the blades. Britannic was still making way, perhaps 6 knots, perhaps less, but enough. Enough that the 2 lifeboats, caught in the current along the hull, drifted steadily toward the stern, toward the propellers. The propellers were enormous. The 2 outboard screws were 23 feet in diameter, 3-bladed cast bronze, each one weighing 38 tons. They turned slowly now, almost lazily, but with the kind of force that could churn water to froth and snap wood like kindling. The center propeller was smaller, 16 feet, 4-bladed, driven by the turbine. All 3 were still rotating, and the 2 lifeboats, packed with crew and a few patients, were drifting directly into them. Someone on deck saw it happening and screamed a warning. People in the boats saw it too. They tried to row, digging the oars into the water, pulling with everything they had. But a lifeboat loaded with 60 people is heavy and sluggish, and the current was stronger. The first boat, number 28, reached the port propeller and was pulled into the blades. What happened next was over in seconds, but those who saw it never forgot. The propeller caught the boat at the stern, lifted it and smashed it to pieces. Wood exploded. Bodies were thrown into the air. Some were struck by the blades, killed instantly. Others went into the water and were pulled under, dragged down by the suction, their clothing tangled in the churning wake. The sea turned red and white, blood and foam, and then the wreckage drifted aft, and there was nothing left but splinters and floating debris. The second boat, number 30, met the starboard propeller moments later. The men aboard tried to jump, some succeeding, some not. The boat was smashed just as thoroughly, reduced to planks and canvas and bodies. In less than a minute, 60 people had been killed or maimed, not by the mine, not by the sinking, but by the ship's own machinery, by a failure to stop the engines in time, or to hold the boats until it was safe. Violet Jessup, standing at her station on B-deck, did not see it directly, but she heard the screams and the wet crunch of wood breaking, and she knew. She knew what it meant when the screaming stopped. Her own boat, number 2, was being loaded now. She helped lift the stretcher cases aboard, then climbed in herself, squeezing into a space near the bow. The boat was packed, shoulder to shoulder, nurses in white aprons and wounded men in brown blankets, and crewmen in blue jackets. Someone gave the order to lower. The davits creaked. The boat jerked downward, swaying, scraping against the hull. Violet gripped the gunwale and watched the sea rise up to meet them. They hit the water hard. The boat rocked, shipped a little spray, then steadied. Oars were unshipped. The crew began to row, pulling away from Britannic's side. But as they cleared the hull, Violet looked up and saw the propeller. The starboard screw, still turning, massive and terrible, rising out of the water now as the stern lifted. The ship was going down by the head so steeply that the stern was coming up, the aft decks tilting skyward, and the propeller, half exposed, was directly in their path. She realized, with a cold clarity, that they were going to die the same way the others had. The current was pulling them toward it. The men were rowing hard, but it wasn't enough. She could see the blades, see the water boiling around them, and she thought of Titanic, of the lifeboat she'd been in that night, rowing away from the sinking ship while people screamed in the water. She thought, not again, not like this. And then she jumped. She didn't think about it. She simply stood up, stepped over the side, and dropped into the Aegean. The water was a shock, cold despite the southern sun, and it closed over her head, and she kicked upward, breaking the surface, gasping. Behind her, the lifeboat was pulled toward the propeller. She heard shouting, heard the crunch, and then she was swimming, arms flailing, trying to get away from the suction. Something struck her head. A piece of debris, hard enough that her vision went white, and she went under again, swallowing seawater, choking. When she surfaced the second time, someone had her by the arm. A crewman, treading water, holding her up. He dragged her toward another lifeboat, one that had cleared the propellers, and hands reached down and hauled her over the side. She lay in the bottom of the boat, coughing, blood running from a gash on her scalp, and watched Britannic die. The ship's bow was completely underwater now, the foredeck submerged to the bridge. The forward well was gone. The funnels stood at a steep angle, and as the ship tilted further, the foremost funnel broke loose. It had been held by guy wires and rivets, but the stress was too much. The stays snapped with sounds like gunshots, and the funnel toppled, falling forward in a great slow arc, slamming into the sea with a crash that sent up a wall of spray. It floated for a moment, this enormous yellow tube, 62 feet tall and 17 feet across, and then the water poured in through the open top and it sank. The second funnel went next, then the third. They were dummies, those two, not connected to the boilers, added purely for aesthetics because passengers expected 4 funnels on a great liner. But they were heavy all the same. Steel shells filled with air. And when they fell, they took rigging and ventilators and deck fixtures with them, a cascade of wreckage tumbling into the water. Captain Bartlett was still on the bridge. He'd stayed there, issuing orders, sending wireless messages, coordinating the evacuation, even as the deck tilted under him. He'd clipped a life jacket around his chest, but made no move to leave. Officers stayed with their ships. That was the code, the unwritten law, and Bartlett was a man who honored such things. He stood at the forward windows, watching the water rise toward him, and waited. At 9:07, 55 minutes after the explosion, Britannic's bow struck the seabed. She was in shallow water here, only 350 feet deep, not even the length of the ship herself. Her bow hit bottom while her stern was still 40 feet above the surface, and the impact jolted through the hull like a shockwave. Everything that wasn't bolted down went flying. Furniture, equipment, bodies. The grand staircase, that beautiful sweep of oak and iron, collapsed inward, the banisters snapping, the steps folding like a house of cards. The pipe organ's gilded pipes tore loose and crashed through the dining saloon wall. Glass shattered. Ceilings came down. The forward boilers, still hot, ruptured as seawater hit them, and steam exploded through the bulkheads in a roar that could be heard on shore. The stern rose higher, 50 feet, 60, the aft decks almost vertical now, and then the ship rolled to starboard. Slowly, ponderously, she turned on her side, the starboard rail dipping toward the water. The port side lifting, and the lifeboat still hanging from the davits swung inward and smashed against the superstructure. People jumped from the boat deck, some hitting the water cleanly, some striking debris. The ship groaned, a sound like tearing metal and breaking bones, and the stern began to slide under. Captain Bartlett was thrown from the bridge as it went under. The water hit him like a fist, cold and violent, and he was pulled down, dragged into the darkness by the suction. He clawed upward, lungs burning, and broke the surface gasping. A piece of wreckage floated nearby, a section of decking, and he grabbed it and held on. He was unconscious when they found him, 20 minutes later, floating face up with his life jacket, keeping him just barely above water. A motor launch from a nearby destroyer pulled him aboard, and he woke coughing seawater and asking how many were saved. Britannic settled on her starboard side at the bottom of the key channel, her hull intact, her engines still warm. Fish would find her within days, algae within weeks. She would lie there, undisturbed, for nearly 60 years. On the surface, the sea was filled with lifeboats and debris. Wreckage spread across half a mile of water. Deck chairs, life rings, pieces of railing, shattered wood from the destroyed lifeboats, and bodies. Not many, mercifully, but enough. They floated face down in their life jackets, turning slowly in the current, white aprons and blue uniforms stark against the water. The Greek fishermen from Kea arrived first. They'd seen the explosion from shore, seen the great white ship steaming toward them, and then tilting, sinking, and they'd launched their kayaks, small wooden fishing boats with single masts and patched sails, and rowed out to help. They found survivors clinging to wreckage, pulled them aboard, wrapped them in blankets that smelled of fish and salt. The fishermen spoke no English, and the survivors spoke no Greek, but there was no need for words. The fishermen rowed them to shore, to the small harbour at Carissia, and laid them on the beach under the sun. Royal Navy destroyers arrived an hour later, steaming at full speed from Piraeus and Athens. HMS Heroic, HMS Scourge. They launched motorboats and picked their way through the debris field, calling out, searching for anyone still in the water. They found a few, not many. Most of the survivors were already in lifeboats or on the fishing boats rowing toward land. The destroyers took them aboard, hundreds of wet and shivering people, and turned toward port. A hospital ship, HMHS Britannic's sister in service if not in blood, arrived by evening and took on the wounded. The irony was not lost on anyone. Men who had been patients on Britannic were now patients again, transferred from one floating hospital to another, as if the sea itself were trying to swallow them and kept failing. The count, when it was finally tallied, came to this: 1,065 people had been aboard Britannic that morning. 1,035 survived. 30 died. Most of those 30 had been in the 2 lifeboats that met the propellers, though a few had been killed in the initial explosion, blown apart in the forward hold, and a handful had drowned in the confusion, trapped below decks, or too injured to swim. 30 dead out of 1,000. It should have felt like a miracle. And in a way, it was. Britannic had sunk faster than Titanic, gone under in less than an hour, and yet 97% of those aboard survived. The lifeboats had worked. The evacuation had been orderly. The crew had been professional. The Greek fishermen had been brave. Everything had gone as well as could be expected, given that the ship had struck a mine in a war zone and sunk in less time than it takes to eat breakfast. But 30 people were still dead. 30 people who had woken that morning, expecting to reach Lemnos by evening, expecting to load wounded soldiers and sail home, expecting to survive the war and see England again. 30 people who had been killed not by the enemy, not directly, but by a failure of timing and machinery and luck. Violet Jessup sat in a lifeboat, her head bandaged, watching the place where Britannic had gone down. The water was calm again. There was almost nothing to mark the spot. A few pieces of floating wood. A deck chair, drifting. The sea had swallowed the largest ship in the world and left barely a trace. She thought about Titanic, about the way that ship had stood on end, the stern rising high into the night, hundreds of people clinging to the rails, and then the lights going out and the long slide into darkness. Britannic had gone differently. Faster, quieter, tilting on her side like a tired animal lying down to sleep. But the result was the same. Another great ship gone. Another list of the dead. She wondered, sitting there in the sun, if White Star Line was cursed. 3 sisters. Olympic, Titanic, Britannic. One still afloat. One on the bottom of the Atlantic. One on the bottom of the Aegean. 3 ships that were supposed to dominate the seas for decades, reduced to 2 wrecks and a survivor. The company had invested everything in them. £7.5 million. And now, 2/3 of that investment was gone, lost, unrecoverable. The official story would be simple. Britannic struck a mine. A German mine, laid in neutral waters, in violation of international law. A hospital ship, clearly marked, sunk by an enemy who had no honor. That would be the story in the newspapers, in the Admiralty reports, in the speeches given by politicians. And it was true, as far as it went. But there were other truths, quieter ones, that would emerge only later. The portholes left open, the watertight doors that failed to close, the decision to restart the engines and drive the ship forward, which may have accelerated the flooding. The lifeboats lowered too early, before the propellers stopped. These were not acts of villainy. They were mistakes, human errors, the kind of small failures that happen in any disaster. But they mattered. They were the difference between 10 dead and 30, perhaps more. And there was another question, one that would linger for years, whispered in naval circles and debated in engineering journals. Had Britannic been sabotaged? The question of sabotage came not from conspiracy theorists or grieving families, but from the Admiralty itself. Within days of the sinking, a quiet inquiry began. Not public, not announced, just a handful of naval officers in a room in Athens asking questions that had uncomfortable answers. Britannic had been in port at Naples for 2 days before her final voyage. During that time, she'd taken on coal, fresh water, medical supplies, and a small number of additional crew. The port was not secure. Italian longshoremen had access to the ship. Civilian contractors moved freely through the lower decks. Security was lax because hospital ships were supposed to be immune from attack, protected under the Hague Convention. What threat could there be? But Naples in 1916 was a nest of spies. German agents operated openly in the city, watching British ship movements, noting departure times and routes. Some were Italian nationals sympathetic to the Central Powers. Others were German nationals posing as Swiss or Swedish businessmen. The Italian government, though nominally an ally of Britain, was riddled with divided loyalties and corruption. A man with enough money could buy almost anything in Naples, including access to a hospital ship. The theory, never proven, but never quite dismissed, was this. A German agent had placed a time bomb in Britannic's coal bunkers during the Naples stop. A simple device, perhaps, a charge of dynamite with a mechanical timer, hidden among thousands of tons of coal. When the ship was well out to sea, the bomb detonated, blowing a hole in the hull that looked, from the inside, exactly like a mine strike. The flooding pattern matched. The location matched. And if it was a bomb, that would explain why the watertight doors had failed. An internal explosion would have warped the bulkheads, damaged the hydraulics in ways a mine strike from outside would not. It was a tidy theory. It explained everything. But there was no evidence. No remnants of a bomb were ever found. Though, admittedly, no one went looking at 350 feet down in 1916. No German agent was ever identified or arrested. No confession ever emerged. And the official inquiry, when it convened in Gibraltar a month later, concluded that Britannic had struck a mine. A German mine. The evidence was circumstantial but sufficient. The Germans had been laying mines in the key channel. Other ships had struck them. Britannic had been unlucky, nothing more. Captain Bartlett testified at the inquiry. He was still weak, still recovering from his time in the water, but he was clear and precise. He described the explosion, the flooding, the attempts to save the ship. He took full responsibility for the decision to restart the engines. He had believed, he said, that beaching the ship was the only chance to save her. He had been wrong. The forward momentum had increased the flooding, driven water through the open portholes, accelerated the sinking. He had made a mistake, and men had died because of it. The board did not censure him. They noted that his decision had been reasonable given the information available at the time. They commended his efforts to evacuate the ship in an orderly fashion. They praised his courage in remaining aboard until the end. Captain Charles Bartlett left the inquiry with his reputation intact, but he never commanded another ship. He retired quietly and died in 1928, his obituary making no mention of Britannic. The question of the open portholes received more attention. Hospital ships needed ventilation. The wards were crowded, the air thick with the smell of wounds and disinfectant, and in the Mediterranean heat, closed portholes would have made conditions unbearable. But leaving them open violated basic damage control procedures. It was a calculated risk, and on November 21, 1916, that risk had killed the ship. The inquiry recommended that, in future, all portholes on hospital ships be kept sealed below the waterline, regardless of ventilation concerns. It was a simple rule, easy to enforce, and it might have saved Britannic. But the rule came too late. Violet Jessup also testified, though her account was brief. She described the explosion, the evacuation, the moment she jumped from the lifeboat to avoid the propeller. She was asked if she had seen any evidence of sabotage, any suspicious persons in Naples, any unusual activity before the voyage. She had not. She was asked if she blamed the captain or the crew for the deaths. She did not. She was asked if she would continue to serve at sea. She said yes without hesitation. And she did. She returned to White Star Line after the war, worked aboard Olympic for years, survived a collision with a warship in 1934 when Olympic struck and sank the Nantucket lightship, and finally retired in 1950. She died in 1971, age 83, having survived 3 major maritime disasters, and earned the nickname Miss Unsinkable. In her memoirs, she wrote more about Titanic than about Britannic, as if the second sinking had been less traumatic, or perhaps simply less newsworthy. But she kept a small photograph of Britannic on her bedroom wall until the day she died. The political aftermath of the sinking was muted. Britain was losing thousands of men every week on the Western Front. The loss of a hospital ship, tragic as it was, barely registered in the newspapers. The Times ran a short piece on page 5. The Illustrated London News published a drawing of Britannic sinking, based on survivor accounts, with a caption condemning German barbarity. But within a week, the story was gone, replaced by reports from the Somme and Verdun. The German government denied responsibility. They claimed, through neutral Swiss intermediaries, that they had not laid mines in the Key Channel and had not targeted hospital ships. This was almost certainly a lie. German naval records captured after the war showed extensive mining operations in the Aegean, and at least 2 other ships had struck mines in the same area in the months before Britannic sank. But the Germans maintained their denial, and there was no way to prove otherwise. White Star Line filed an insurance claim for the loss of Britannic. The ship had been valued at £1.2 million, though she had never earned a penny in passenger revenue. The insurance company contested the claim, arguing that the ship had been lost in a war zone and was therefore not covered under the standard policy. The dispute dragged on for 2 years and was finally settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, rumored to be less than half the ship's value. White Star Line took the money and moved on. They had Olympic at least. One sister still afloat. But Olympic's war service was almost as troubled as Britannic's. In 1918, while carrying American troops to Europe, she rammed and sank a German U-boat, U-103, becoming the only merchant vessel to sink an enemy submarine by ramming. The crew painted a kill marking on the bridge and were celebrated as heroes. But Olympic also collided with the British warship HMS Hawke in 1911, and later with the Nantucket lightship, and earned a reputation as an unlucky ship, a ship that attracted disaster. Some sailors refused to serve aboard her. They called her the Old Reliable, but they said it with a certain irony, as if reliability was the most you could hope for from a ship whose sisters had both gone down. The financial impact on White Star Line was severe. The company had borrowed heavily to build the Olympic-class liners, expecting to recoup the investment over decades of profitable service. Titanic's loss had been catastrophic, but at least she'd been insured. Britannic's loss was worse in some ways, because the ship had never generated revenue. She was pure loss, a £1 billion investment in modern terms, that simply vanished into the Aegean. White Star never fully recovered. The company limped through the 1920s, building smaller ships, merging with Cunard in 1934, and finally disappearing as a separate entity in the years after World War II. The Olympic-class liners, which were supposed to establish White Star's dominance for a generation, instead marked the beginning of the company's decline. But there were human costs beyond the balance sheets. 30 people died on Britannic, and their stories are harder to trace. Most were crew, men whose names appeared in the casualty lists, and then vanished from history. A few were nurses, women who had volunteered to serve, and were killed by the ship's own propellers. One was a doctor, a surgeon named Reginald Beauchamp, who had stayed below decks trying to free a trapped patient and drowned when the water rose too fast. Another was a stretcher-bearer named William Sharp, who had survived Gallipoli and made it all the way to the hospital ship, only to die within sight of the Greek coast. Their families received letters of condolence from the Admiralty, formal and brief. Your son, your husband, your father died in service to his country. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. But of course it was forgotten, almost immediately, buried under the avalanche of death that was the First World War. 30 people out of 20 million. A rounding error. Some of the survivors fared better. The wounded men were transferred to other hospital ships and eventually made it home to Britain, Australia, New Zealand. A few recovered fully. Most carried their wounds for the rest of their lives. One soldier, a private from Sydney named Thomas Murphy, later wrote that he'd been sunk twice, once when his troop transport was torpedoed in the Mediterranean, and once aboard Britannic. He said he was done with ships after that, done with the sea, and spent the rest of his life in the Australian outback, as far from water as he could get. The nurses, most of them, went back to work. There was a shortage of medical staff, and the war ground on for 2 more years. Some served on other hospital ships, others went to field hospitals in France and Belgium, trading the relative safety of the sea for the mud and shrapnel of the front lines. At least one, a VAD nurse named Catherine Gould, was killed by shellfire at a casualty clearing station in 1917. She had survived Britannic, only to die 9 months later in a trench. The Greek fishermen who had rescued survivors were never officially recognized by the British government. There were no medals, no commendations, no letters of thanks. The Admiralty inquiry mentioned them in passing, noting that local fishing vessels had assisted in the rescue, but their names were not recorded. It was only decades later, when historians began to research the sinking, that anyone thought to ask who these men had been. In the 1970s, a Greek researcher named Michalis Galanos tracked down some of the fishermen, or their descendants, and collected their stories. They remembered the morning clearly. The explosion, the white ship tilting, the sea filled with people and wreckage. They remembered rowing out, pulling survivors from the water, some of them injured, some of them in shock, all of them grateful. The fishermen had asked for nothing in return. It was simply what you did when ships sank off your island. The sea took, and sometimes you could take back. One fisherman, Yanis Papadakis, said he'd pulled a nurse from the water, a young woman with blood on her face, unconscious or nearly so. He'd laid her in the bottom of his boat and covered her with a blanket, and when she woke she'd asked, in English he couldn't understand, about the others. Were they safe? Had everyone gotten off? He'd nodded, not knowing what she was asking, and she'd closed her eyes and wept. He never learned her name. It might have been Violet Jessup. It might not have been. The sea had been full of nurses that morning. The question of why Britannic sank so much faster than Titanic troubled naval architects for years. Both ships had struck damage below the waterline. Both had flooded through multiple compartments. But Titanic had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, while Britannic went down in 55 minutes. The difference was significant, and the explanations were technical and unsatisfying. The open portholes were part of it. Titanic's portholes had been closed. Britannic's had not. Water pouring through even a dozen open portholes could add hundreds of tons of flooding per minute, overwhelming the pumps and destabilizing the ship. The design of the watertight bulkheads was another factor. Britannic's bulkheads had been raised higher than Titanic's, which should have made her safer. But the raised bulkheads also meant the compartments were larger, and when they flooded faster. The ship could survive more compartments flooding, in theory, but the speed of the flooding was greater. And then there was the decision to restart the engines. Captain Bartlett's attempt to beach the ship had driven water through the bow wound at a much higher rate than if the ship had simply drifted. Naval architects calculated that if Britannic had stopped dead in the water and allowed the pumps to work, she might have stayed afloat for another 30 minutes, perhaps an hour. It might not have been enough to save her, but it would have allowed more time to evacuate, more time to organize the lifeboats, more time to avoid the disaster with the propellers. But these were calculations made in hindsight, with full knowledge of what had happened. Bartlett had not had that knowledge. He'd made the best decision he could with the information available, and it had been wrong. That is the nature of disasters. Good decisions fail. Bad decisions succeed. Luck matters more than skill, and afterward everyone pretends it was inevitable. The wreck of Britannic lay undisturbed for nearly 60 years. The location was known, more or less. Survivors had noted the position, and the Greek Navy had marked it on their charts as a hazard to navigation. But no one had the technology to dive that deep, and there was no particular reason to try. The ship was gone, the dead were buried. What was there to find? In 1975, Jacques Cousteau changed that. The French oceanographer and filmmaker had spent decades exploring the Mediterranean, and he'd heard the stories of the Great White Hospital ship lying on the bottom of the Key Channel. He brought his research vessel Calypso to the site, along with a team of divers and a small submersible. On a calm day in October, they descended to the wreck. What they found astonished them. Britannic lay on her starboard side in 390 feet of water, deeper than the survivors had estimated. The hull was largely intact. The superstructure had collapsed inward, crushed by the weight of the ship and the impact with the seabed. But the basic form was recognizable. 4 funnels, or what remained of them. The boat deck, the bridge, twisted and broken, but still there. And inside, glimpsed through torn plating and collapsed decks, the remnants of the grand staircase, the dining saloon, the hospital wards. Cousteau's cameras captured it all. The mosaic tile floors, still bright under the divers' lights. The beds, rusted but intact, lined up in rows. A surgical table bolted to the floor of what had been an operating theatre. Windows with the glass still in them, frosted with algae. The great reciprocating engines, silent and dark. The pistons frozen in place, each one 12 feet across. Cousteau's footage aired as a television documentary in 1976. And suddenly, the world remembered Britannic. The images were haunting. A grand staircase leading nowhere, its oak banisters draped with seaweed, chandeliers hanging at impossible angles, their crystal prisms coated in silt. A ship built for luxury, dressed for war. Now a tomb resting in the twilight zone of the Aegean. The documentary reignited interest in the Olympic-class liners. Titanic, of course, had never been forgotten. But Britannic had faded from public memory, overshadowed by her more famous sister. Now people wanted to know the story. Why had she sunk? How many had died? Why had no one talked about this? The answer to that last question was complex. Britannic had sunk during wartime, when news was censored and public attention was focused elsewhere. She'd been a hospital ship, not a luxury liner, so there were no wealthy victims to mourn, no industrialists or socialites whose deaths would make headlines. And the death toll had been relatively low, 30 people out of 1,000. Tragic, yes, but in a war that was killing 30,000 in a single day at the Somme, it barely registered. But the wreck itself told a story that statistics could not. Cousteau's divers swam through corridors that had once carried nurses and patients, past staterooms that had been converted to officers' wards, through the swimming pool with its Portuguese tiles still gleaming under the silt. The ship had been preserved by the depth and the relatively calm waters of the Mediterranean. Unlike Titanic, which lay in pitch darkness at 12,000 feet, crushed by pressure and scoured by deep currents, Britannic rested in shallow enough water for natural light to penetrate, for divers to explore without specialized equipment. In the years after Cousteau's expedition, other teams followed. Technical divers, archaeologists, historians, all drawn to the wreck. They found artifacts that Cousteau had missed or chosen not to disturb. A ship's bell, recovered in 1995 and donated to the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool. Porthole frames, some still with their brass dogs intact. Pieces of the grand staircase, sections of carved oak that had somehow survived 7 decades underwater. Medical equipment, surgical saws and scalpels, still sharp. And personal items. A nurse's watch, its hand stopped at 9:07. A crew member's pipe. A leather medical bag with brass fittings, the initials RB stamped on the flap. Reginald Beauchamp, perhaps. The surgeon who had drowned trying to save a patient. These artifacts were treated with reverence. Britannic, unlike Titanic, was a war grave. 30 people had died aboard her, and their bodies, or what remained of them, were still inside the wreck or scattered on the seabed nearby. British law and international maritime conventions protected such sites. Salvage was forbidden. Even diving required permits. The Greek government, in whose territorial waters the wreck lay, enforced these rules strictly. But enforcement was imperfect. In the 1990s and early 2000s, illegal divers looted parts of the wreck. They took portholes, brass fittings, anything small enough to carry, and valuable enough to sell. One particularly brazen theft in 2004 saw a team of divers cut away a section of the ship's hull to access the bridge and remove the ship's telegraph, the device used to communicate engine orders. The telegraph was recovered by Greek authorities a year later and returned to the wreck site, but the damage had been done. The hull was open, exposed to currents and decay. The looting prompted calls for better protection. In 2003, the British government officially designated Britannic as a protected war grave. The Greek government followed suit, imposing fines and prison sentences for anyone caught diving the wreck without permission. A permanent mooring buoy was placed at the site to prevent anchors from dragging across the hull. And a campaign began to have Britannic recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, alongside Titanic and other historically significant wrecks. That campaign is still ongoing. Britannic has not yet received World Heritage status, in part because she lies in relatively shallow water and is accessible to recreational divers, which makes protection difficult. But the effort continues, driven by historians and descendants of those who served aboard her. The wreck has also become a site of pilgrimage. Every year, on November 21st, a small ceremony is held on the island of Kea. Descendants of survivors, historians, and local Greeks gather at the harbor and lay wreaths on the water. A priest offers a blessing. Sometimes a naval vessel from the Greek or British Navy attends, and sailors in dress uniforms stand at attention as a bugler plays the last post. It is a quiet memorial, far from the grand commemorations that mark Titanic's sinking, but it is heartfelt. One of the attendees, for many years, was a woman named Margaret Bartlett, the granddaughter of Captain Charles Bartlett. She came to Kea in 1995 for the first time, 79 years after her grandfather had survived the sinking. She laid a wreath at the harbor, and then chartered a boat to take her to the wreck site. She stood at the rail, looking down at the water, and said a prayer for the 30 who had died and the 1,000 who had lived. In interviews afterward, she spoke of her grandfather's silence about the sinking. He had never discussed it with his family, never mentioned the ship except in passing. It was only after his death that she'd learned the full story, reading the inquiry transcripts and survivor accounts. She said her grandfather had carried guilt for the rest of his life. The decision to restart the engines, the lifeboats lost to the propellers, the 30 dead. He had done his best. The inquiry had exonerated him, but he never forgave himself. He died in his sleep in 1928, and among his papers was a sealed letter addressed to the families of those who had perished on Britannic. It was never sent. In it, he apologized. He wrote that he had tried to save the ship and failed, and that he would carry the weight of that failure to his grave. Margaret Bartlett read the letter at the 1995 memorial service, her voice breaking, and then folded it and placed it in the wreath before it was set on the water. The influence of Britannic's sinking on maritime safety is harder to quantify than Titanic's, but it was real. The lessons learned from her loss, combined with those from her more famous sister, shaped the design of ships for decades afterward. Watertight integrity became an obsession. Naval architects studied the flooding patterns of both ships and redesigned bulkhead systems to prevent water from bypassing compartments through cable ducts, ventilation shafts, and open portholes. New regulations required that all openings below the waterline be fitted with remotely operated closing mechanisms, so that in the event of damage, every porthole, every door, every hatch could be sealed from the bridge with the push of a button. Lifeboat procedures were revised. The disaster with Britannic's propellers led to new rules requiring that engines be stopped completely before any lifeboats were launched. Training drills were mandated, not just for crew, but for passengers, and the drills had to include launching boats while the ship was listing. This was a direct response to the difficulties encountered on both Titanic and Britannic, where lifeboats on the low side could not be launched properly. Damage control training became standard for all crew, not just officers. Every sailor, every steward, every fireman was taught how to shore up a breach, how to operate watertight doors, how to use pumps and manage flooding. The assumption that a ship's officers could handle any emergency was abandoned. Disasters happened too fast. You needed every hand trained and ready. And there was a broader cultural shift. The idea that ships could be unsinkable, that technology had conquered the sea, died with Titanic and was buried with Britannic. The new generation of liners built in the 1920s and 1930s, ships like Normandy and Queen Mary, were marvels of engineering, but their designers never claimed they were unsinkable. They were safer, yes, better equipped, better designed. But the sea was still the sea, and hubris was still hubris. Interestingly, some of the safety improvements pioneered for Britannic were not widely adopted until after she sank. The ship had been fitted with a double hull along part of her length, a second skin of steel plates separated from the outer hull by a gap of several feet. The idea was that if the outer hull was breached, the inner hull would hold and prevent flooding. It was a good idea, and it might have saved Britannic if the mine had struck further aft. But double hulls were expensive, and most shipbuilders did not adopt them until regulations forced the issue in the 1950s and 1960s. The question of what exactly sank Britannic has never been fully resolved. The official conclusion was a mine. German naval records confirmed that mines had been laid in the Key Channel by the submarine U-73 in the weeks before Britannic's final voyage. One of those mines, drifting on its anchor cable, had found the ship's hull. But the sabotage theory never completely died. In 1995, a team of divers led by British explorer Robert Ballard, the man who had discovered Titanic's wreck a decade earlier, conducted a detailed survey of Britannic. They used sonar and remotely operated vehicles to examine the hull damage. What they found was puzzling. The explosion had occurred on the starboard side, between watertight compartments 5 and 6, exactly where a mine strike would be expected. But the pattern of the damage suggested an internal explosion as much as an external one. The plating was blown outward in some places, which a mine would do, but also inward in others, which suggested a secondary explosion from inside the ship. Ballard's team speculated that the mine had detonated a coal bunker fire or caused a boiler to explode, creating the internal blast, but they could not rule out the possibility of a bomb. The mystery deepened when researchers examined German naval records more closely. U-73 had laid mines in the area, yes, but the exact locations were vague, recorded only as approximate positions. And there was a curious entry in the submarine's log from November 20th, the day before Britannic sank, noting contact with an unidentified agent in Athens. The entry was brief, just a few lines, and the name of the agent was redacted in the archived version. It might have been routine. Or it might have been something else. We will never know for certain. The physical evidence is ambiguous. The documentary evidence is incomplete. And everyone who might have known the truth, German agents and British intelligence officers alike, is long dead. Britannic's sinking remains, in that sense, an unsolved mystery. The official story is almost certainly true. But the shadow of doubt remains, and it is that shadow that keeps the story alive. In popular memory, Britannic exists mostly as Titanic's footnote, the sister ship that also sank, the lesser tragedy. Documentaries about Titanic mention her in passing, usually in the context of White Star Line's bad luck or the Olympic-class design flaws. But for those who study her, Britannic is a story unto herself. A ship built for peace, pressed into war. A floating palace turned into a hospital. A symbol of human ambition meeting the indifference of the sea. There are memorials to Britannic in several places. In Southampton, where she was registered, a small plaque at the Titanic Engineers Memorial includes the names of the 30 who died. In Belfast, where she was built, an exhibit at the Titanic Museum tells her story alongside her sisters. And on Kea, a stone monument stands at the harbour, inscribed in Greek and English, in memory of HMHS Britannic and those who perished, November 21st, 1916. The survivors, those who lived long enough to see these memorials, had mixed feelings. Some attended the dedications, grateful that their ordeal was being remembered. Others stayed away. Violet Jessup, for instance, declined an invitation to the Southampton Memorial in 1966, 50 years after the sinking. She wrote in a letter that she preferred to remember the living, not the dead, and that memorials felt too much like dwelling on the past. But she kept that photograph of Britannic on her wall, and, in her memoirs, published posthumously, she devoted a chapter to the ship. She described the morning of November 21st in careful detail. The explosion, the tilt of the deck, the scramble for the lifeboats. She wrote about jumping into the sea, about the cold shock of the water, about surfacing to see the ship's stern rising and the propeller churning. And she wrote about the silence afterward, once Britannic had gone down and the sea had calmed. 1,000 people floating in lifeboats and almost no one speaking. Just the creak of oars and the lap of waves and the occasional sob. She ended the chapter with a reflection. Britannic was the most beautiful ship I ever served on, she wrote. More beautiful than Titanic in her way. She was designed to be safer, and she was. She carried more lifeboats, had better watertight doors, had thought of everything. And yet she sank faster, killed just as surely. It taught me that the sea does not care about our designs. It does not care about our intentions. It simply is, and we survive or we do not, and afterward we tell stories to make sense of it. But there is no sense. There is only the sea. That passage has been quoted in almost every documentary and book about Britannic since. It captures something essential about the ship's legacy. Britannic was supposed to be the answer to Titanic, the safe sister, the ship that learned from tragedy. And, in many ways, she was. 97% of those aboard survived, a remarkable achievement, but she still sank. She still killed. And the reasons why, the exact sequence of decisions and failures and accidents that led to her going down in 55 minutes remain debated to this day. The wreck continues to deteriorate. Each year, divers report new collapses, new sections of hull falling away. The grand staircase, still recognizable in Cousteau's footage from the 1970s, has largely collapsed. The swimming pool's tiles are being covered by sediment. The engines, those massive monuments to industrial power, are slowly being consumed by rust and marine life. In another 50 years, perhaps less, Britannic will be unrecognizable, reduced to a mound of wreckage on the seabed. There have been proposals to raise her, or at least to stabilize the wreck. In the 1990s, a salvage company proposed cutting away the superstructure and floating the hull to the surface using airbags, the same method used to raise the Mary Rose and other historic wrecks. The plan was rejected. Britannic lies too deep, the hull is too fragile, and the cost would be astronomical. More importantly, she is a war grave, and disturbing her would be both legally and ethically questionable. So she will stay where she is, in the clear blue waters of the Key Channel, slowly dissolving into history. Divers will continue to visit, to take photographs, to marvel at the scale of her. Historians will continue to debate what sank her and why. And every November, a small group will gather on Kia and remember. The legacy of Britannic is not as clear or as dramatic as Titanic's. There was no James Cameron film, no blockbuster bringing her story to millions. But in quieter ways, she mattered. She mattered to the wounded soldiers she carried before her final voyage. Thousands of men brought home from hellish front lines. She mattered to the nurses and crew who served aboard her, who saw her as a symbol of mercy in the midst of war. And she mattered to the 30 who died, and the 1,000 who survived, and the families who mourned or rejoiced. She also mattered to the engineers and naval architects who studied her sinking and made ships safer. The changes implemented after Britannic saved lives in future disasters. When Andrea Doria sank in 1956 after a collision, better lifeboat procedures meant fewer deaths. When Laconia caught fire in 1963, improved damage control training helped contain the blaze. These were incremental improvements, invisible to the public, but real. And perhaps Britannic's greatest legacy is simply this. She reminds us that safety is never final, that every solution creates new problems, that the sea remains unconquered despite all our technology. Titanic taught us that arrogance kills. Britannic taught us that even humility is not enough. You can learn every lesson, fix every flaw, and still the sea will find a way. The story ends, as all such stories do, with silence. The sea off Kia is calm most days. Fishing boats pass over the wreck without knowing it's there. Tourists on ferries to the islands look out at the blue water and see nothing but beauty. And far below, in the twilight, a great white ship lies on her side, waiting. Her funnels are gone, collapsed into rust. Her grand staircase leads nowhere. Her engines will never turn again. But she is still there, still recognizable, still Britannic. The largest ship in the world once, the pinnacle of luxury and safety. His Majesty's hospital ship. Sister to Titanic, companion to Olympic. Now just a shadow on the seabed, a memory fading with each passing year. A story that refuses to be completely forgotten. 30 people died. 1,035 lived. And somewhere in that arithmetic lies a truth we prefer not to examine too closely. That survival is often luck, that death is often chance, and that the line between tragedy and miracle is thinner than we like to believe. Britannic sank on a clear morning in calm seas, with every advantage Titanic lacked, and still she went down. That is her story. That is her legacy. Not a triumph, not quite a tragedy, but something in between. A ship that did everything right and still failed. A ship that saved 1,000 lives and lost 30. A ship that lies now in eternal silence, waiting for the sea to finish what the mind began, waiting to be forgotten, waiting to be remembered. The white pride of the ocean's medical world, as Violet Jessup called her. Now just bones on the bottom, bright tiles under silt, and a story that whispers, the sea does not care. Build your ships, make them strong, make them safe, paint them white and mark them with crosses. It will not matter. The sea does not care, and yet we build them still.